We're in an interesting place in the Bible as our church family reads through Scripture together this year and reading about all the minor prophets, so-called minor prophets of the Hebrew people. And this week we've been reading from Habbakuk. I know that's everybody's favorite book in the Bible, and you read there all the time, I'm sure. But I was reminded of a movie Bruce Almighty. Who's seen that? I mean, it's on TV all the time, even now. But in the movie, the main character played by Jim Carrey, his name is Bruce, and he gets upset because of all what he calls the unjust things that are happening in the world. Mostly he's upset about things that he doesn't like happening, but he acknowledges there are unjust things that are going on. So he complains. And eventually he challenges God and says, I could do a better job than you. I could handle, if I had the power you have, I could handle all the problems in 5 minutes. And so he challenges God. And while not quite on that level, this Hebrew prophet Habbakuk has some pretty serious questions to ask of God. He challenged him and wrestled with him in a sense to get some answers, and even challenged him and wrestled with him on some of the answers that he actually got. So today, as we're looking through this interchange that took place over time, I'm sure, the first thing that I want us to talk about is this: how long will God allow evil to go unchecked, and why? You know, it's interesting that I oftentimes hear people say that if there is a God, he would not be allowing all the horrible things that happen in this world. He wouldn't allow all the evil and the injustice that's going on in the world right now to keep happening, because he would be able and willing to do something about it. And so since that's not what's going on, many choose either just to deny that God exists, or they live in this perpetual sense of anger with God. I find it interesting that people would deny that God exists because he's unjust, because without someone who establishes what justice is, how do you know what's unjust? What is justice but things happening exactly the way they're supposed to happen, with proper reward or punishment for good and bad deeds? There has to be some standard of what's good and what's bad. There has to be something that compels us to want justice, and that's a universal desire. And so with that kind of context in mind, let's look at Habakkuk starting in chapter 1, and let's read verses 2 through 4 to get us started here. This is Habakkuk speaking to the Lord. He says, "O Lord, how long shall I cry for help and you will not hear?" Ever felt that way before? Or cry to you violence and you will not save? Why do you make me see iniquity, and why do you idly look at wrong? Destruction and violence are before me. Strife and contention arise. So the law is paralyzed. Justice never goes forth. For the wicked surround the righteous, so justice goes forth perverted. So what's he saying here? Habakkuk says, look, there are wrongs, there's violence, there's evil that's going on all around me. And God, you don't seem to be listening. You don't seem to be helping. You don't seem to be lifting a finger. You sit idly by. Not idle like IDOL, like idolatry, but idle like the car's idling, or I'm sitting back doing nothing. I'm resting. He says, you're just sitting around doing nothing. And the result is that the law is powerless. Nobody pays attention to it anymore. There is no justice. And because there's so many more wicked people than righteous people, Habakkuk says that justice itself is perverted. And that word means to be twisted or bent out of shape. Okay? So let me ask y'all, have you heard complaints like this in our world today? What are some situations that raise these kind of questions in the circles in which you travel, or maybe even in your own life? What kind of questions about these things do we hear today? Is there any injustice that people are concerned about or upset about?
How can God let people starve in impoverished nations?
How can God let people starve to death? Yeah. What else? Why does God let people that I love die, especially if it's a painful death, or someone dying before we think it is their time to die? Why do only the good die young, as Billy Joel says? What else? What other kinds of injustice do we see people up in arms about or complaining to God about these days? Poverty in itself, yes.
I was seeing an interview with a celebrity recently on, I think it was Jimmy Fallon's Tonight Show, and they said that the reason they don't believe in God is because there's so many good people that receive very unjust things, like circumstances in their life.
Okay.
In other words, why do good people not have comfort? Why do they not have, things, or whatever they kind of wanted to? But it basically came down to good people have bad things happen.
Good people have bad things happen. And that's exactly what Habbakuk was doing. He was saying, look, I'm trying to do the right thing, and I am surrounded by evil. My eyes are constantly seeing all of the problems in the world, and God, you don't seem to be doing anything about it. Anything else?
And kind of the opposite of what he said. Why do bad people succeed or unethical people
Why do bad people succeed? That's another big one. We see people who seem to be doing all the wrong things and experiencing all the good stuff in life, right? Money, wealth, power, experiences, fame. There's a couple of others that are kind of big we hear about from time to time. And that is, and that's related to the two things we just talked about, and that is the disparity, wealth disparity, and the fact that there are extremely rich people and extremely poor people, and racial injustice, right? So, do you believe that in our time, justice, at least to some extent, has been perverted, twisted, bent out of shape? Can you give me an example? It can be personal or general, all right? Let's just see how...
That's fair.
Yeah.
They have to leave everything they have, or have to put up with fear that everything can be taken away. They can't do anything about it.
Yeah. I mean, we see more and more as Christians, we want to and should focus on that, on how many of our brothers and sisters in Christ face persecution around the world. I mean, North Korea is horrible. China has this tension where they say that people are free to be Christians, but they want to control the churches. And so most of the churches that are really being church are underground. We see Boko Haram every week is attacking Christian church buildings and killing people throughout Ethiopia and spreading out from there. In North Africa and Egypt, there's persecution that goes on. Mexico is one of the countries that's up near the top of the list of persecution on the world watch list for persecution of Christians. So yes, there's lots of that going on. There's injustice going on in those issues. And anybody, just in case we've gotten so caught up in just what it took to get up and get here this morning, or to watch if you're watching online, and this question of, is there injustice, and what are some examples of injustice? Let's just think about in our country right now for the last few years. If you go back to Michael Brown in Ferguson there and listen to the cries of people for justice, and it's interesting that there's people on all sides of issues all crying for justice. Whether it's people who are crying for justice for Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri, and others like him who have died unjustly, as they see it, others who are declaring the injustice of people who would take out their frustrations on law enforcement officers, and round and round. Everybody's wanting justice and crying out that there is injustice. And we've become a very angry people. So let me ask y'all a question this morning. In this atmosphere, where justice has been, at least to an extent, perverted and bent out of shape, is God really listening? Or is God ignoring? Is God sitting by idly, not lifting a finger to help? What do you think? Let's take a vote here in the room. How many think that God is not doing anything about injustice in our room? How many of you think that God is doing something? How many of you are not sure? You're waiting like Habbakuk just to see what he's going to do. Yeah, so there's honest questions here. Interestingly enough, God actually answers Habbakuk, and I think that there's some things that we can learn from that, because yes, Habbakuk is actually complaining, but God's not afraid of these complaints. So look at what it says in verse 5 of Habbakuk chapter 1. This is God speaking. Look among the nations and see. Wonder and be astounded. For I am doing a work in your days that you would not believe if told. For behold, I am raising up the Chaldeans, that bitter and hasty nation, who march through the breadth of the earth to seize dwellings not their own. They are dreaded and fearsome. Their justice and dignity go forth from themselves. Their horses are swifter than leopards, more fierce than the evening wolves. Their horsemen press proudly on. Their horsemen come from afar. They fly like an eagle, swift to devour. They all come for violence, all their faces forward. They gather captives like sand. At kings they scoff, and at rulers they laugh. They laugh at every fortress, for they pile up earth and take it. In other words, siege works and then take it. Then they sweep by like the wind and go on. Guilty men whose own might is their God. So what's God saying here? He says, look among the nations and see. What is it that he wants Habbakuk to see? What did he want Habbakuk to see? Yeah, what he was doing with the Babylonians, right? Listen again. Look among the nations and see. Wonder and be astounded. What is so astounding about what God told him? He was astounded, told him that he should be astounded, and then he begins to tell him about what the Chaldeans, or the Babylonians, that's another name for the Babylonians, were going to do. Why was that astounding?
Wanted the people to see how bad they were.
He wanted people to see how bad they were. Okay, he did, but and God's describing these Babylonians as saying they're terrible people. They are guilty men whose own might is their God. In other words, they worship their own powers. So God, here's what God's saying. Look, Habbakuk, I'm already working on the problem, but you're not seeing it because you're looking at your situation and what you can see. And you can't see the big picture of how I'm going to handle this altogether. So he's saying, look, I'm going to handle this. I'm already working on it with the Babylonians. They are going to come to Judah, to your place of where you live, and they are going to be instruments which I use to bring justice and judgment on all those people that you just complained about getting by with their sin with no recompense from me. So, but here's the astounding thing. The Babylonians were horrible. They were evil. We see all these things they do. Even God says they're dreaded, they're fearsome. They come in, swoop through, they take what's not theirs, and then they move on to do it again. So when we have questions of God about injustice, what does this response to Habakkuk say to us? Look among the nations, see, wonder, be astounded. I'm doing a work in your days you would not believe if told. And then he tells him. What is he saying to us when we question the injustice based on his response to Habakkuk?
That our perspective causes us to not actually see how God is fighting injustice, and that it's not in the ways that we necessarily would want him to.
Yeah. God's saying, look, you don't see what I see. You don't know what I know. And I don't have to do things the way that you think I should do them. Because you don't see what I see and you don't know what I know. But if you saw what I saw and knew what I know, then you would recognize that what I'm going to do is the best way of handling the situation, even if you don't understand it. He says, you wouldn't believe it even if I told you. And then he tells him, and he was right. Habakkuk was, he was astounded. What was so astounding about this? That he would use the Babylonians to bring justice.
The Babylonians themselves were lacking justice.
Okay. Yeah. The Babylonians themselves were lacking justice. He said here they make up their own justice. Their justice comes from themselves. They're just making it up as they go along. Whatever they think is right, that's what they do. So in other words, they were worse than the people of Judah that Habakkuk was complaining about needing justice. So here's the thing. Don't miss this. Habakkuk had a complaint. He wanted to hear from God because he saw injustice going on without there being anything happen, without God doing anything about it. So God answers his question, answers his complaint, but Habakkuk didn't like the answer. I mean, you think about it. What if we complain, God, why do you let all of the injustice that's going on in the United States of America go on without there being any judgment on those who are perpetrating this injustice? And God says, hold on, I've got North Korea coming to take care of that. What would you think? Huh? You think, God, have you flipped your mind? Have you lost it? Are you crazy? Don't you know this dude, this nut that's running North Korea over here? You're going to let him come over and he's the one that you're going to allow bring justice to us when North Korea is being run in a far worse way even than our country is? So that brings us to a second question, the second thing for us to talk about. What if you don't like God's answers? God, injustice is everywhere. Why aren't you doing something about it? God says, I am doing something about it. You just don't see it yet because you're too focused on right here, right now, and you're not seeing what I'm doing in the grand scheme of things. And that's kind of what Bruce Almighty's problem was. He wanted God to solve his problems right here and now. He didn't see that God was taking care of billions of people and nations even. That's something I don't want you to skip by right here. God is he's talking about dealing not just with individuals with justice and injustice. He's talking about dealing with nations. He's going to judge Judah with Babylon, and we're going to see in a few minutes he's going to judge Babylon by the Medes and the Persians and so forth. So it's just going to go on and on. That nations are accountable to God just as people are. But what if we don't like the answers that God gives? What happens, you think, to people? How do they respond when they make a request of God or offer a complaint to God, truly looking for God to do something, and God's answer is not what they wanted to hear? What are some ways that people might respond in that situation? They get angry with God. That's one of the top ones. Right. What else? They just go ahead and do what he told them not to do in the first place. Right. What else?
Doubt and distrust.
They doubt him. They get distressed. They may even reject that God exists. Like the person that Jonathan was talking about. I see good people trying to do what is right, and they're being punished for it. They're being, I see bad things happening to them, so I don't believe God even exists. Well, let's look and see what Habbakuk did. Because you know what Habbakuk did when he didn't like God's answer to his complaint? He complained some more. Here's this holy man of God, but look, he was so much just like us. Listen to what he says in Habbakuk 1, verses 12 and 13. Are you not from everlasting, O Lord my God, my Holy One? We shall not die, O Lord. You have ordained them as a judgment, and you, O Rock, have established them for reproof. You who are of purer eyes than to see evil and cannot look at wrong, why do you idly look at traitors and remain silent when the wicked swallows up the man more righteous than he? Now notice a couple of things here. First of all, he begins with an acknowledgement of who God is. Okay? He refers to him by the name that God gave for himself when Moses asked, who should I tell the people of Israel that I've come on behalf of to rescue them from Egypt? The name Yahweh in Hebrew, or it means I am. And so he says, you are from everlasting I am, my God. So he's praising God. He's saying, I know who you are. You're the one who has always been and always will be. You are holy. That means set apart. You're beyond. You're otherly. You are just the great God. Why do you think he started off that way before he started complaining again? What do we see in that? Does that indicate anything to anybody here? He was praising him, so what did that show?
That he ultimately trusts God.
Even though he was complaining, he recognized who God was and is, and he was telling him, I'm still trusting you, God. I just don't like the answer you gave me. Right? I think we see from this that God is not upset when we question him or when we even complain maybe about what's going on, just sincerely saying, God, I don't understand, and I don't like what I see going on, and I don't like what I'm hearing here, but I know that you are God. He's okay with that. Now the next phrase we see here is a little bit harder to nail down. My translation says, we shall not die. Some translations say, you shall not die. And, there's discussion about, because sometimes translating from one language to the other can be difficult. And there's just like a matter of an ending of the word, that's added on there that determines what person is actually being talked about here. But the idea is, it could be, Lord, you have always been around and you will always be around. You're never going to die. And you know what you're doing because you're the one who exists forever. Or if he's saying we shall not die, as most translations say, he's either continuing to respect the Lord and respectfully affirm that God is faithful to his promises, even though he's about to bring judgment in a way that Habakkuk doesn't like. Or maybe he's just laying the groundwork for complaint because of his astonishment of what he just heard, that it's the Babylonians that God's going to use to bring judgment on his people. And maybe he's saying, Lord, you're not going to wipe us out. Are you? Remember what he said back in verse 5? You're going to be astounded at what I'm doing in your day. You wouldn't believe it even if I told you. Well, Habakkuk is astounded. And it reminds me what we see here when in verse 13 of what we read Habakkuk say back in verse 3. Back verse 3, he said, why do you make me see iniquity, and why do you idly look at wrong? And here in verse 13, he says, your eyes are purer than mine, and their deeds, the Babylonians' deeds, are more wicked than ours. How can you sit back and quietly watch them do their horrible things and do to a people who are more righteous than they are? Doesn't make sense, God. Why are you looking on this and allowing it to happen? Then Habakkuk goes on to use this illustration of the Jewish people being like fish. And he says the Babylonians are like fishermen. They come, they throw their hooks, and they draw people in, or they bring their nets and just drag them along and gather up all these fish, and they take them away. They sell them, and they get rich off of it. They're living in luxury, and they're laughing about what they're doing to us. And they couldn't care less about who they're doing it to. And how long is this going to go on, God? How long are you going to let them just keep going on and on and on, doing their horrible things? And so after making this response of complaint to God because Habakkuk doesn't like their answers, chapter 2 starts with him saying that he's standing on the wall of the city like a watchman, just waiting to see God answer. And listen to the way that God answers in Habakkuk 2, verses 3 and 4. This is very important, okay? Not just for Habakkuk, but for us in our day. God says this, for still the vision awaits its what? Its appointed time. It hastens to the end. It will not lie. If it seems slow, do what? Do what? Wait for it. It will surely come. That's a guarantee with God's name attached to it, okay? It will not delay or not happen. Verse 4. Behold, his soul, that's Babylon, his soul is puffed up. It is not upright within him, but the righteous shall live by his faith. Now, what's he saying here? Well, first of all, we see the Lord gives him these words. He says, you need to know that I am going to make sure the justice is done, but you need to wait for the right time. There isn't an appointed time. Who appointed the right time? God. What gives God the authority to make the appointed time? He's God, right? He's God. He can do whatever he wants. And if he says, I'm going to bring justice, you just have to wait for the appointed time, and I guarantee it's going to happen. Then is it going to happen at just the time that God knows is best? You better believe it. And I say that not just as a figure of speech. You better believe it. He's going to do it. Because he follows up these questions with talking about how that he's going to bring judgment on Babylon, and Habakkuk sees this vision of the Lord coming with this splendor and glorious light, and he's shaking the earth in wrathful judgment, and the mountains are shaking, and the rivers are shaking, and the nations are being shaken, and the sun and the moon are shaken and being blotted out by darkness. And we just see this scary, apocalyptic, end times kind of scene going on here. It is all a part of God's judgment. But why is God doing this? In all of this chaos and carnage, the key to what God's doing here with the judgment and the shaking of everything and all the things, seems like all hell is breaking loose, but it's really God's judgment that is coming down. The key is in verse 13. Look at verse 13 here. You went out for the salvation of your people, for the salvation of your anointed. Hold on just a second. Think about that. God is about to bring justice to Judah, Habakkuk's people, the remnant of the nation of Israel. He's about to bring judgment on them through Babylon. But he's also going to bring judgment on Babylon through others because of their evil ways. But he says, Habakkuk recognizes the reason that God is going out and bringing judgment is for the salvation of your people. Habakkuk sees that ultimately justice and mercy, though he doesn't understand it all and how it's all going to work out, it's about knowing the great Creator God. It's about knowing the Lord. And while justice demands wrath for all of us, because Habakkuk wanted the people of Judah to be judged, but he didn't want to be included in that. But he was going to be there when the Babylonians came along. So everybody was going to have to suffer the consequences of their national sins. And so while justice demands wrath from all of us, God's mercy, which we see more clearly from this side of the cross, is devised and designed to satisfy justice and offer grace through faith in Jesus, who was for Habakkuk's friends the long promised Messiah, but for us is the proven Savior who went to the cross and then rose from the dead. And he's saying that anybody who trusts in him today receives grace rather than the justice we all deserve. And when Habakkuk got to know the Lord better through his wrestling with God, then all of the pieces began to fall into place. He began to see what he didn't see before when he was just looking at his situation instead of looking at the nations. He began to see that it was all about God. And he said in chapter 3, verse 17, I think I skipped a few slides. You got it? All right, good. He said this: though the fig tree should not blossom, nor fruit be on the vines, the produce of the olive fail, and the fields yield no food, the flock be cut off from the fold, and there be no herd in the stalls, yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will take joy in the God of my salvation. God, the Lord, is my strength. He makes my feet like the deer's. He makes me tread on high places. What's he saying? He's given a picture of economic collapse. No food, no wealth. He's showing not only what's going to happen to Judah and to Jerusalem, but what can happen to the whole world. But he's saying, even if I lose everything that matters, no matter how bad it gets, Habakkuk said, I will rejoice in the Lord. I will rejoice in the Lord. How could Habakkuk rejoice in the Lord when everything was going wrong? If he lost everything at the hands of the Babylonians who came as the judgment of God on his nation? How could he rejoice? Because we know the end result. What does that tell us that would enable him to rejoice? What is it we know about the end that's worthy of rejoicing even when everything is going wrong?
The New Jerusalem.
Okay. And what do we know about that life that is good or worthy of rejoicing?
We'll be with God.
We'll be with God. There you go. It's all good at that point, right? We have the promise that there'll be no more sadness, no more sickness, no more pain, no more death, no more crying. Won't even be anything to cry about. It just goes to show you there won't be any rom-coms in heaven because, you know, how you always get a little bit teary-eyed at those crucial moments. Everything is good in heaven. Everything will be good with the Lord. And Habakkuk says, but here's the thing. The reason that it's so good that he could endure anything is because he began to see how good and how great God really is. That he's a God of justice, but he's also a God of grace. Let me ask y'all this question. Why is it so hard for us to wait for God to bring justice at his appointed time? What makes that difficult for us?
We don't like waiting.
We don't like waiting for anything. That's right. That's part of it. Absolutely. We want it in our timing. What else?
Fear of the unknown.
Fear of the unknown? Mm-hmm.
Because we think we're so important that we have now. Just focus on our
Surely God should move this situation to the top of his priority list and handle it right now, right? That's how Habakkuk felt about what was going on in Jerusalem and in Judah. Come on, God. This is your people. Surely you care about us more than anybody else. Why aren't you doing something about all the injustice? People are being defrauded. People are being abused. There are people who are being sold into slavery. There's all these horrible things happening. Why aren't you doing something about it right now? But here's what I think is a clue to what makes this so difficult for us. Back in Habakkuk verse 2, in verse 3, chapter 2, verse 3, I skipped over this part, but I don't want to miss it. He said, if it seems slow, wait for it. It will surely come. It will not delay. Behold, his soul is puffed up. Talking about Babylon. It is not upright within him, but the righteous shall live by his faith. Let's be honest. I'll be honest about the way I see it for me. When I get upset about injustice and I get concerned about God's not acting immediately, at least in part, it's because I don't trust God to judge the way I think he should. I think he should judge harshly and quickly. And God says, I'm waiting for the appointed time. And I'm giving opportunity for mercy, but I'm going to judge. You just have to wait on me. But I think, if God doesn't judge now, maybe more horrible things are going to happen before he's able to nip that in the bud or take that person out. And that may be true. But God is going to judge. And in the meantime, if I'm really trusting God, if I am living by faith, as it says that those who are right with God are to do, then that is the defining characteristic we see in this book of those who are right with God, is that they are living by faith. Then I can trust him even when I don't know the answers, or like the timing within which God decides to do the right thing. So what does it mean in the context of this living in an age and in a culture where there's injustice going on? What does it mean for us to live by faith? What does that look like to y'all? Can you give me some descriptions of what's involved in that?
Time for ourselves, finding him and allowing him to handle it. And I mean, I know it sounds so simple, but it's like so many times we say we're going to and wait on his time, but then we pick up the piece again and go try to run with it again and try to have that control. And we
Yeah.
out of fear. And what we're really saying is that we don't trust him.
Yeah. That's the second time we've heard that word fear. It is a fear that God is not going to handle it in the right way, in the right time. And fear is unbelief. It is based on my not trusting God. So it's trusting him enough to be dead to myself and to my plans and say, okay, God, what are you going to do? What else does living by faith in the context of injustice look like?
I think part of it is measuring our our dependence on the systems, like governmental systems that we have in place, and measuring our patriotism. Because from our perspective, we are obviously Israel in this story, and someone else will be Babylon, right? But from someone else's perspective, surely we're Babylon.
Yeah.
And so, and I think that applies also to our, like, we want justice to come swiftly through, the law or through the police force or through social
Military
action
intervention.
or whatever.
Military.
But then at the same time, God's doling out justice in His timing when He sees it. You said earlier this minute ago that we want swift justice, but that's only half true because we want swift justice when people wrong us.
Yes, exactly. Exactly.
Wronging. I don't want justice to be
No,
because,
not at all.
So I think there's a level of, I guess this kind of ties into what Colin was saying, but like there's a level of we have to shift our perspective on how justice works in our world and not be so dependent on other people to fix things, but be dependent on God to fix things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
His timing, not when we want it to happen to us, as we see Habbakuk.
Very good. Yeah. So it's a change of perspective. And didn't we see that with Habbakuk? God said, look at the nations. He said, look at what's going on around you. Don't just look at your own private situation. Look at the big picture. That was the first thing that he said to Habbakuk in his response to the first complaint. So it is a matter of changing our perspective. It's a matter of not trusting in systems and institutions and governments to be wholly responsible for bringing justice, but looking at ourselves. So, and I think that living by faith then in part means, or an implication at least, as we see this in the context of Scripture, that was other Scripture and other prophets from that time period, was that we need to be pursuing justice in our relationships with others. And as people who live by faith, how can we help bring, maybe not an end, because we live in a world that is sickened by sin and that will not be healed completely until Jesus returns. How can we live in faith and bring about some remedy for the injustices that we see around us? Are we responsible for that, you think, as followers of Jesus?
Yes.
So tell us, Jordan, what your thoughts are on that and what we can do.
I think if you look, I think there's so much, people get daunted by the idea of fighting for justice, social justice, whatever, fighting for justice in the world, but the basic tenets are laid out so simply in the commandments that in the Old Testament and the New Testament, that if we were not only talking about this and thinking about the orders we've been given, the marching orders we've been given, but actually acting them out, than we would be in whatever small part if we were fighting for the poor, the needy, if we were loving our neighbors as we love ourselves, not just in theory but in practice on a daily basis, then we would, if everyone was doing that, we could be shifting the entire paradigm just by following those commandments.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. I think when we try and tackle social justice or be justice in our community, we're putting the cart before the horse. And that, like Jordan said, if we just focus on the greatest commandments that Jesus said, love the Lord our God, love our neighbor as ourselves. If that's our emphasis, that's what we're like, we align our lives around those, then being just will come out of that.
Yeah, justice and charity and all that should be a natural outpouring of that focus.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. These are hard questions. And there are simple answers to what we can do, simple to say, but not easy to bring about results, in part because it requires that we give up our own rights to what we want, have a different perspective that's not focused on me and on us, and to look at others, sometimes those who they don't like us, whether it's because we are Christian and they're not, and they've had that experiences, or their cumulative knowledge of Christians is that we're the people who always say you can't do this, you can't do that, you can't do anything that you want to do, and we want to limit your freedoms. They've had a bad experience in the past with Christians, whatever. So partially it's because of that. Sometimes it's because they have a different culture. The color of their skin is different. They've been people who have suffered injustice for so long and have suffered the consequences of that for so long. Sometimes it's hard to help because they don't trust anybody, because they learned a long time ago that when they trust, it comes back to bite them. So, how do we go about bringing justice? All we can do is love. All we can do is love our neighbors as we love ourselves, and love God with all of our hearts. And in doing so, that helps us to see, look, I am a Babylonian, deserving of justice. But God demonstrated his love for me, and that while I was still a sinner, Christ died for me. And when we get to thinking that God is not doing anything and seems like he's not working at all, don't forget that the Apostle Peter said, people tell us that Jesus isn't coming back again because we've been saying that for years and nothing has changed. And everything goes on just as it always has. But the reason is not because God is not ever going to do anything, but because God is being patient to give everybody a chance to repent and come to faith in Jesus. Because he wants everybody to have that chance. And at the appointed time, then ultimate justice will come about. In the meantime, we are called to live by faith in love for God and for people, whether we are able to bring about results or not, no matter how painful it may be, because many have stood for justice and they have paid time in prison, they have paid with their lives, they've paid with the lives of their family members, they've paid with financial ruin, loss of reputation, being outcast from in their families or in their communities. But for us, being church needs to trust, number one, that God is a God of justice, and his justice is working in His timing. And number two, we remember that we are called to love people no matter what. Whether they're just or unjust, righteous or unrighteous. And as we are growing in this understanding of daily living by faith and being church 24/7, not just here on Sunday mornings, I think that one of the evidences for us truly being church is that we're going to let God use us to represent justice and those who love justice and seek justice with mercy for individuals. But what it all comes down to, and as Habbakuk learned, was the most important thing about us being able to endure injustice and to trust in God's justice is we have to get to know Him better. The better we know Him, the more we can trust Him. The more we can trust Him, the more we can rejoice even in the midst of injustice. I had another question, but I think that probably is a good place for us to start wrapping this up. I want to ask you just to be considering. Are there issues in your personal life, in your family, in the world around you that where you're concerned about injustice? Maybe you're angry about injustice. It's okay to be angry about injustice. Jesus was unhappy and angry about injustice. But as you think about those things, those situations, ask, are you angry because it hurts you? Are you angry because God's not doing what you want Him to do in the timing you want Him to do it? Are you angry because you know that people are being hurt by the injustice of others, and yet you're willing to trust God in His perfect timing, in His perfect way, to be working His perfect justice, leading to the time when everything will be operating in perfect justice in His kingdom? That's a question. I know it's a multifaceted question, but that's a question for us to ask ourselves. And I want us to take a few moments, just you and God. Ask God what He's saying to you today. Are you angry and unforgiving with someone who has done wrong to you? Are you angry at God because He didn't deal with them more swiftly or more harshly? And if so, remember Jesus said, if you don't forgive them, I can't forgive you of your unforgiveness. And that's hurting you. You continue to be dogged by the pain, not just of what was done to you that was wrong, but of your unwillingness to trust me to handle it. I also want to ask you to ask God what He wants you to do to live by faith and to trust Him, to be an agent for justice. Whether it's in a personal relationship, whether it's helping someone who has been treated unjustly based on their socioeconomic status, their culture, their color of their skin, their lifestyle. God's not asking you to justify their behavior necessarily, but to love them enough to want to see them treated and as people of value. He wants to use you. So ask him what he wants you to do.